Well, good afternoon, everybody. And on behalf of Temple Health and Bioscience District, I want to thank you all for joining our September e-learning series webinar. Today, we are really honored to welcome attorney Gail Peek of counsel with Baird, Culchin, Brophy, Bostwick, and Dixon, otherwise known as the Texas firm. From 1993 to 2005, Gail served as Vice President and General Counsel at Wilson Art International, a Fortune 500 company. Ms. Peeks also practiced bankruptcy law and commercial litigation at Kirkland & Ellis, a premier firm in Chicago. Her legal experience includes general business counseling, employment law, commercial litigation, international and domestic acquisitions, divestitures, and antitrust law. Today, Gail's here to offer guidance from the legal perspective for individuals and businesses looking to navigate the waters of the COVID-19 climate. So Gail, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for your time and for sharing your expertise. I want to invite our audience to just mute yourselves to avoid interruptions, but please, we ask that you would utilize the chat box to ask your questions throughout Gail's presentation. And we will engage Gail for a little Q&A. And Gail, with that, the stage is officially yours.
Well, thank you very much. And I think one of the things that my resume shows is persistence. And that's the key for having a good business. I don't know if most people are aware, but your journey toward business is interesting because businesses usually fail within the first 5 years. And that is very common. And my approach is to try to get people to look at ways that will at least push you toward success. Now, if you're beyond that 5-year period and you are running and gunning, great. But those of you who are on track for the 3 to 5 year period, I hope you get some takeaways that will help you avoid that 5-year, I guess it used to be the 7-year itch in marriage, 5-year itch in business. My hope is that all of you will have a takeaway. And let me hasten to say that what I will be talking about is what I have seen as a lawyer who does a lot of employment law and what has changed and affected the COVID-19 process. And it's just my perspective. And it is not the perspective of other lawyers or my law firm or any firm that I've been or company I've been associated with. It is just a human to human contact. And again, my hope is that you will have some takeaways on this. Mary is very helpful and she'll advance my slide because I am technologically challenged, as they say. That is my firm, our address. I'm up in Waco. And my email. If you have any questions after this presentation, please feel free to contact me or contact Mary Green or Tammy Annabelle. And I think you'll find if you have any questions during the presentation, we'll try to take them. For the privilege of using your time, I'm going to try and stay on track. So if we don't answer your question immediately, we will have an opportunity at the end of the presentation. And if we still miss your question, we will have other ways for you to contact us. Okay, Mary, you can advance the screen. As I say, they're reflections because I've been around for a long time and we are not going to go into how long. Suffice it to say, it's more than 10 years. And it's interesting for an employment lawyer because when I looked at employment law, I didn't realize it was very close to family law. It's a matter of communication, it's a matter of listening, and it's a matter of being flexible. That's what you have at home, and that's what you need in business. You can advance the slide. The challenges for employers, size doesn't matter. If you're a small firm, sometimes you're in a better position because you can be more nimble, more flexible, because you haven't become set in your ways. And so if you start instituting what I call best practices, then you're en route as you grow. you just have the training already. You already have the best practices. For those of you that are with firms that are entrenched, you may be a franchise so that your degrees of freedom are small. You still need to have best practices. They may not be ones that you can implement down line, but they can maybe suggestions when your franchisor is available. And these are best practices that I've found as a general counsel at Wilson Art. And I've advised small and medium firms to implement them. When I say best practices, again, it's communicate, communicate, communicate. And I have one general rule that I practice in life as well as in business. If you wouldn't want it done to you, don't do it to others. Keep that in mind. It isn't a hard and fast rule, but I always tell people, if you're going to let someone go, they should not be surprised, which means part of that best practices, you should have at minimum, annual evaluations. It's fair to the employer, it's fair to the employee. It lets them know how they're doing so that they have an opportunity. If things aren't going well, they can leave. You have an opportunity to say, I told you, here's what I need done. But have a plan. When you have this conversation, if it's someone you want to keep, you can put them on probation. You can identify 3 to 5 things that you want to see within a set period of time, within 30 days, within 45 days, something that will let them know, here's the goal. If you don't meet that goal, we're going to be talking again, and it may not go so well. And that's what I mean by communication. And also documentation. Documentation. I know we used to live in a world where your word was your bond, your handshake was as good as your word, all those things. Well, in the business world, that may still work, but the more common one is document. So if an employee is not working well, document it and explain to the employee, here's what my goal is. Because most people, if you were on the receiving end of a disciplinary action, you go, oh no, I disagree with this, I'm angry, and you become frustrated, a morale issue. But if you have good communication, you can minimize that effect. It is never happy to be placed on probation. It's always difficult to deal with that. And I tell you, so many employees don't want to go through employee evaluations because you don't want to have that conversation, but you must. That's the only fair thing to do. If you were raising a child and the child was off of the reservation and doing things, you would probably talk to the child. It's the same thing with an employee. Employee is not a child. Do not hear me saying that. But the conversation, the fairness of letting people know what's going on is important, because the employee needs to have the opportunity to decide what the employee's future is going to be, and you need to know what the future of the company is going to be. And I say that also in the sense that don't rush to judgment. There are some employers who decide on things that, I like this employee, so I'm going to maybe have a margin of error for that person. But another employee, I don't like that employee so much, so I'm going to be hard and fast and they're out. Be consistent. If your rule is your rule, it's your rule. And that consistency is another of those best practices that I'm mentioning. So if you have an employee who is on the bubble, be fair and let that person know you're on the bubble and why. And it shouldn't be because I don't like you, because you just don't, you're just not what I'm looking for. You should have concrete reasons for why the person is not working, some examples of what is going wrong and that you need to see improvement. That really helps. And that, again, is a fair approach to take. So we have no surprises. So with employment, so you have evaluations, regular evaluations, you have documentation, and you have consistency. That's the start of best practices. I mean, there are others, but for the time limitation, I think if you start implementing those, we'll be in a better place. And I don't have a show of hands, but I don't think, when I've done an assessment, I've asked employers, you're not in the business of hiring lawyers, are you? And they don't seem to gravitate toward that. So let's see if we can get into the world where you're using your funds as you intended, not making the life of a lawyer much more lucrative. And that's my goal. Find out when you need a lawyer, use a lawyer when you need one, but there's some things that you may not need a lawyer for. There are a number of federal and state laws, and under COVID, there are so many things. I mean, it's a very fluid situation. You have the CARES Act, you have the Payment Protection Program, and right now, the federal government is looking at some alternatives. In addition, the SEC is reviewing its rules. The Department of Labor is reviewing its rules. So it's a very fluid environment, and no lawyer can tell you exactly what the rules are going to be in 5 months or 3 months. But they can tell you if you have best practices and you treat your employees fairly, you're going to be in good shape. Now, one of the things to keep in mind, if it's an issue of Americans with Disabilities Act or things like that, you're going to need a threshold of employees before that law applies to you. One of the best and free resources you have is the Texas Workforce Commission website. You don't need a lawyer to tell you what the rules are. Go online and take a look at the Texas Workforce Commission. In fact, the Texas Workforce Commission publishes on an annual basis a book for employers, a handbook for employers that tells you what laws apply, what they do, and do go online and take a look at it. It is wonderful, and you don't need a lawyer to tell you it exists. I'm telling you now, it exists. When I have Johnny be nimble, Johnny be quick, that's my thought of a small business. You are in the best position to implement good practices. It's when you're an older company, or as I say, you're a franchisee, that you have certain constraints, because as a franchisee, your operations are dictated by the franchisor. But when you're in a company that has been around for a number of years, you're going to find that there's a cultural bent in a certain direction. And it's very hard to change that bent if your best practices moves that bent in any way. So you probably will need a lawyer to help you if you're a mature firm that is looking at implementing best practices. The other important best practice is have an employee handbook and follow it. I tell people, if you're not going to follow an employee handbook, that's the worst world you want to be in from an employment lawyer standpoint. Use your employee handbook. It should dictate what you're going to do and when you're going to do it. And this is something, a subject I'm going to broach that can be problematic. If you have some financial issues and you're not sure where your direction is, don't be afraid to work toward a message to let people know, your employees know, that things that is very, very difficult out there, very competitive, and everything is on the table in terms of looking at options that will keep the enterprise going. And that's a conversation that you don't blurt that out in some way, have it measured. You do want to talk with an employment lawyer about how to present that message so that it's accurate and fair. And again, if you're a big company and you've got a number of people and you're in economic straits, you can't start deciding, I'm going to keep these young employees because the older employees are too expensive. There are laws that you will meet so quickly, it will make your head spin. So work with someone knowledgeable in employment law if you have any ideas about restructuring or layoffs or furloughs, things like that. And we're going to talk about that a little later. Mary or Tammy, are there any questions based on what I've said so far?
We don't have any in the chat yet, but I have a couple of questions, if that's okay, Gail.
Okay.
I'm thinking about our small business and startup friends, and the idea that you mentioned about implementing regular evaluations, be they quarterly, biannually, annually, for organizations, let's say, that are not brand new, but are small. Is there a good way to segue into instituting those for all employees if they haven't existed before?
Right. Well, with startup companies, I encourage them to really hire people when they have to hire people. There is an opportunity to have independent contractors working with you that might be a good approach until you have all the wherewithal to cover the cost of having an employee, because there are a host of issues that come into play. And so if it's a very small company, a startup, I usually ask them, do you need employees now? Or are you in a position where you can use independent contractors because you don't have a regular work, or you need more orders to make your business viable? Don't hire people willy-nilly. That's never a good option for any employer. Does that help?
Yes, it definitely does. And then in terms of like performance evaluations, are those, is there a good way to institute those with your employees if they haven't existed before?
Yes, and let me take that in two pieces. First, if you have an independent contractor, you're not going to evaluate the independent contractor regularly, but you must have an independent contractor contract. And that will set out what the expectations are. Again, fairness. So the independent contractor knows what the independent contractor is going to do, and you as the employer know what that independent contractor is going to do for you. Have some metric. If they don't measure up, you got to let them go.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for employers, when you have employees, I tell companies that have not had employees regular evaluations to let people know you are implementing best practices, and they are going to, that process of implementation is going to cause some changes at the work site. And one of those changes is we're going to have evaluations at such and such a time. If they're annually, just say, we are continuing our annual evaluations, but do them. If they're going to be quarterly, do them. And I also would say a lot of people in the COVID world are thinking about, well, we should have the equivalent of, I would say, combat pay. We should have pay for people that are working through this, or bonuses and things like that. Set those programs out so they are not confusing. Have a start time and have an end time. And if you need to implement the program again later, do that. But if you leave things out there without any end time, then there may be some confusion as to whether that bonus is temporary or is being implemented for a more lasting period. So be very, very clear on every step you take, and document, document, document.
Great. That is extremely helpful. Thanks, Gail.
Okay, and Mary, you can advance the slide.
One more quick question.
Oops, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. Do you recommend that employees write their own evaluations, and then you sit down with your manager and you talk about it? Because my background's science, and that's how we've always done it, but I don't know how, regular businesses do it.
Regular businesses have a form, and you plan on meeting, and I recommend that there be the employer, the employee, and another individual on the employment side, just to make sure of what's said and that they're consistently following the practice of assessments. When you have assessments such as the following, and I'm going to give you a vignette, a scenario, and a hypothetical. Joe Blow works at company A, and company A isn't quite sure what an employee evaluation looks like. So the company says to Joe Blow, here, write up your own evaluation. I think I can pretty much predict what the evaluation is going to look like, and it will be very difficult to make it consistent because it's going to be so unique to Joe Blow. And that's why I recommend that there be a more constant form that the employer uses that touches on all of the practice areas and expectations for the employee, and that there be a space for employee comment. That way the employee can say either I agree or disagree, or I think these things are also important, but you want that exchange. Now, if there is, and you want the document signed by all the attendees, the employer, the other person from the employment side, and the employee, and everybody should have a copy of it. Do not hold it like gold so that the employee doesn't know until there's some problem sometimes. And you say to the employee, well, where's your evaluation? Well, I never got one. Again, fairness. That's at the root of how you deal with employees. So I do not recommend just ceding that process to an employee. I think there has to be a more consistent approach, and ceding the process to the employee just leads to, well, this is my job, and the employer saying, well, I didn't know you were doing that. In which case, that's that problem of communication. It should be very clear what the expectations are for the employee, and it should be very clear what the expectations are for the employer. If there's any doubt, then it becomes a problem. So Tammy, have I answered your question?
Yes, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Okay. I once worked with an attorney who had a wonderful phrase. He said, whenever you have a situation, you have to compare the constants and the variables. So if there are constants and this didn't come up, then we have to look at the variables as the issue. And that's true in the workplace. So if the constant, if you're consistent and there's some unusual development from your perspective, then something has happened, and it's a signal that something has happened in the communication. Either you haven't communicated with the employee, or if you have a manager, the manager hasn't communicated clearly with the employee. So that is why we say document. It clarifies what the constants are and minimizes the variables, because as an employment lawyer, when I have seen difficulties between employers and employees, it's usually in that variable world where the employer thought that the employee was doing X and the employee was doing Y, or something was approved and the forms weren't exactly handled the right way. Just minimize the variables and stick to the constants. And that's true everywhere. And the COVID-19 situation does not change that. Now, the one thing I did want to clarify, and I hope everybody understands, if they don't, please, raise your questions. There are furloughs, there are layoffs, and there are terminations, and they have different legal consequences. A furlough, in COVID, there have been plenty of furloughs, and that's where the employee is not working, but has not been laid off, is still eligible for benefits, and then the question becomes, who pays? So remember, when you think about furlough, you probably do need some guidance from a lawyer or someone more skilled at furloughs in what to do, and have that checklist before you start going, oh, furlough, that's a good idea. A layoff, again, same thing. A layoff, if you have layoffs and furloughs and you aren't below that threshold that I mentioned, with laws of discrimination and Texas has the Texas Labor Code and Human Rights Commission, then you want to make sure that you're not targeting any one group. And so you really need to look at your employee staffing and decide, what do I need to lay off, and have a reason why. And then I recommend, when you are going to have furloughs and layoffs, that you plan a staff meeting to talk to people, because I will tell you what you don't want to happen. People start disappearing from the workforce. That leads to all kinds of sniping and speculation that creates morale issues. And that's the last thing you need if your company is trying to deal with a pandemic. You don't need any internal dissension where people don't know what's going on. And it's very human. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I start looking at a situation and without information, I come up with the most impressive group of horribles that you can think about. And it may or may not be accurate, but without information, I don't know, it's not accurate. Might be, who knows? And that's the point. We shouldn't be in a world of who knows. You should have that communication with your employee. Terminations, those have to be handled so delicately. And there too, I'm one of the few people that I recommend that you have a staff meeting when somebody disappears so you don't have the speculation. It's especially true in this town. And I'll divert for 1 minute. I remember when I first moved to this town, I went to Sam's and was shopping there, and someone came up to me and said, "So you're the new lawyer, eh?" I didn't know them from Adam. You are not anonymous in a small town. And if you have a termination, that also is not anonymous. So you want to make sure that you handle things fairly and appropriately, and you speak to the person and let them know why the decision was made. I always have a saying, and I said it at the beginning, when someone is terminated, it should not be a surprise. If it is, then somebody has not been communicating correctly or well or frequently with the individual. And best practices still matter. It doesn't matter with a pandemic. It just literally doesn't matter. You should have best practices in terms of, as I said, communication, documentation, consistency. You just need to treat people fairly. And one of the things that has come up, and I'm not quite sure at this stage how widespread it is, but I've seen it enough to want to comment on it. There are rules about attendance. And if someone doesn't show up at work for a set number of days without communication, it may be grounds for job abandonment. That's the legal term. You've abandoned the job, and therefore it's a termination. In a world of a pandemic, when people might be in the hospital, or let's use the example of the instances on Fort Hood, where people were AWOL or considered AWOL, and they had been murdered or killed or died, or something happened. So they weren't AWOL, they literally couldn't come to work. And so we can't leave our humanity behind. If someone is sick, that is not the time to start deciding about, job abandonment. Just not the time, because there may be some very, very real reasons why they have not been able to communicate with you. Questions? Okay, then we will move on to the next slide. We at Wilson Art used to have the saying, preserve the enterprise, preserve the customers, and preserve the workforce. That should be the mantra of every business. Of course, the enterprise is the business. Are we saying one is more important than the other? No, we're saying one layers on to the other. If you have an enterprise, you come up with an idea, it's because you have something that you want to sell, a service or product. You need customers. And if you have customers, you also, if you, again, get to that point where you have to have employees because it just works in that business model, then that workforce matters. I have seen situations where people invest in hiring individuals and making those determinations. And then something happens and they lose a person, so they lost that investment in the workforce. We invest in people. Don't think we only invest in equipment. People are very, very important to us. Employees are very, very important. And once we lose sight of that, the other pieces begin to crumble, because if you don't think your employees are important and you start letting them go, where's your customer service? And if your customer service goes, you lose customers, where's the enterprise? So they're all integrated in a way that makes them all thrive. And that is very important to keep in mind. So that's why I say it's very important for employers to utilize the workforce in a way that is fair and reasonable and not take advantage of them. And remember, when under OSHA rules, you are, and that's the Occupational Safety and Health Administration Act, you are responsible for having a safe workplace. If you wouldn't want to work in that area, why would you want others to do that? So if you're in an area that has unclean water, why would you happily or simply allow people to be where there are bad air, bad water, without doing something to make the place safe? And so in COVID, that becomes very important, because now we have the personal protective equipment. We were thinking about that with first responders, but your employees are frightened as well. And so you need to think about the protections that they will have. So if you were in that work environment, or if you are in that work environment, and the beauty of small businesses is typically the owner is right there. Yeah, it's important to make sure that everybody feels safe coming to work. Does that mean you have to go to the nth degree? Not necessarily, but it means you have to be a human being. You have to understand, and people, if you know, you have employees that have to homeschool, you got to figure out how do you work together to make the enterprise thrive during this. And interestingly enough, I've had clients who've said because they took certain actions to help their employees, again, small community, their business grew. More people gravitated toward them because they were trying to take care of their workforce. That workforce also, it's not a workforce that's comes out of thin air. These are people that live in the community. You treat people that live in community well, their relatives, their friends are going to go, oh, that's a good company. I think I want to be with it. So don't think that you're being overly generous by doing things. Be sensible, have a business model, and preserve the enterprise, preserve the customers, and preserve the workforce. You'd be surprised some of the things that people are watching while you're not paying attention to it. And how you treat your employees is one of the things that a lot of people watch. Next slide.
Quick question, if I may,
Sorry.
Gail. In terms regarding OSHA guidelines, are those updated on any sort of a regular basis?
I encourage people to go to, the government is very good about giving information. I always tell people, though, when you get that information, look at some other sources so you're making your own decision. Don't rely on one source versus the other. But OSHA.gov is a very good site to go to. The DOL.gov, DepartmentofLabor.gov, excellent resources there. And I tell people, go look at the press release, because that's when they, either they've investigated somebody or they've made a settlement. Those press releases can be very telling, very, very telling.
Good tip. Thanks, Gail.
The workforce do's and don'ts. And this also goes for employees. I think that we need to think about, I spent quite a bit of time talking about how employers should do things, but also their obligations for the employees. The world of, I'm very old school. I can remember my first job, I was just grateful to have a job. Sometimes that still applies and sometimes it doesn't. I remember one person saying to me that they interviewed an employee and the first question the candidate had was, what are your vacation policies? Well, what kind of impression do you think that made? And the person was not hired. But you do want to know what you're looking for in a workforce. And if those, what we call soft skills, like working with other people well, communication are important, you need to make sure you convey that to the person. If you hire someone who has a history of not working well with others, then you can predict the outcome there. With building the future, I think, again, when we look at businesses, have a business model, and if you think it's a good one, don't veer from it. But I do this personally, and I recommend that others do it. Look at your model every 2 to 5 years, because the environment changes. Have an idea of what you want, and make sure you're communicating well with your employees. Now, how do you do that? What do you do? What do you do if you have staff meetings or things like that, or meetings with your key managers? What are you telling them? And be consistent, and don't say one thing to them and something else to people outside of that room, because whatever you say in that room will probably be heard outside of that room. You can bet on that. So you might as well be consistent, because that's the right thing to do. And then if you have a growth plan, have metrics. That's the one thing I've found with a number of businesses. When I say metrics, they look at me like I'm speaking Greek. It's what you measure. How do you want your business to grow? How, and when I say how, it's not just how many people What does that customer base look like? What kinds of products do you have in the pipeline? If you don't, think about them. Maybe there is something that you're not anticipating. Those are very, very helpful. And there, I mean, this is very individualized according to the company, but do make plans and do communicate them. And when you bounce ideas off of people, don't get wedded to anything, but it's very fluid. The smaller you are, the more nimble you are, the more agile you are. Be open to all kinds of ideas. Some of them may be things that never occurred to you. And I tell people, if you're going to brainstorm, everything goes on the table. You may decide, no, I don't think that's for us, but at least put it on the table, because sometimes ideas lead to other ideas. And those can be very, very creative opportunities. But make sure you communicate well with the people before they leave that room, so that people don't have some misimpression as to what direction the company is going to go in. I mentioned before, there are all kinds of things that are happening now because of COVID. The CARES Act, that was the Family's First Response to Coronavirus Act. That was the one had the $1,200 and various extensions to the Family Medical Leave Act, all kinds of things that were designed to try to help people go through what we all thought was going to be maybe 4 or 5 months of pain. Now we're into probably the 6th and 7th month, and there's no end in sight. We don't see that. So that's why we have to think about some more things. But in terms of all of these, decide what you need to do. If the CARES Act gives you an opportunity, and here's where you have to call on several skill sets. The CARES Act has a component that involves payroll tax benefits. That's where you should work with your accountant and make sure you've got all those I's dotted and T's crossed, because I don't know if you're watching the news now, but the government is going after companies that have fraudulently received certain of these benefits, and they're doing it fast and they're doing it nationally. So make sure how you act. But also the CARES Act was designed to help businesses, and it goes through year end, through December 31st, 2020. It was designed to help in those instances where I mentioned job abandonment, where your employees are ill, you don't have the money to help them. Well, it says, yes, you do, but you can take it out of the payroll tax part of it. So there were efforts to try to make it as palatable as possible for you to keep employees on and not let them go if they are ill or they have to care for someone who's ill, or if their lives are impacted because of COVID, i.e. they can't get childcare. And at one point, there was some question as to whether childcare even matters if school is out. And the answer is, it can. So you want to look at all of these things. Now, with the payroll protection program, there is where you have had a number of instances where the government has gone after companies. So work with your banker and work with your accountant to make sure if you want to get that loan, or you've gotten that loan, or there's another avenue. I think there's some talk about another tranche of money available, or some of it may be at the state level. And I know that Texas has about $6 billion of federal funds that have been transferred to it that have not yet been allocated. I'm not quite sure how that will be allocated, but the point is that there may be opportunities to support you in your small business. But it comes with various strings attached, and make sure you understand what those strings are. And there are a number of other programs. As I said, there are state programs as well as federal programs. But work toward looking at DOL.gov, OSHA.gov, Texas Workforce Commission website. These are all avenues to get access information without having to hire a lawyer. And if you don't understand something, then you may need a lawyer to help you walk through that. But basically, there's a lot of opportunity out in them Var Hills, but you want to make sure that it's what you want to take advantage of, and you meet the criteria set out in the various statutes or acts that are set up by federal or state or municipal governments. Any questions? Okay, next slide. This is really for employees. When I say reinvention is key. With employees, sometimes we have chosen a path that we want to use as a career option, but it's just not working. You know, we're not finding positions that we thought were for us. We aren't feeling valued. You know, I'm not quite sure. Various things occur. One of the things that I suggest people do is take out a pad, draw a line through the center, have a plus sign on one side and the minus sign on the other side, and just do a self-awareness accounting. And it may be that what you chose is not the field that you enjoy. It's not the field that you love. It's not the field you were designed for. It's a field to help you pay your bills, maybe. But there are lots of ways for you to end up paying your bills. So I encourage people to really think about that. And they may need to reinvent themselves. And I have helped people reinvent themselves after talking with them, and they describe the things that give them true joy. And believe it or not, there are careers where that fit right then within their pure joy. And so that's why I'm in reinvention may be key. So if one career path isn't working, think about another. I will tell you that I've had at least 4 career paths. There are consistencies in some, and there are variables in some. And that goes back to that consistency and variable, because ultimately, here's the bottom line question. If you're not satisfied, why? Is it the environment, the job, or you? And do not be reluctant to ask the or you side of it. We tend to try to dismiss that, but sometimes we need to really do a little fact check and home check on ourselves. And when you do that, you find out that you're not in the right spot. And if you're not in the right spot, it's not going to get any better. With law students, for example, I tell them when you interview, look at what the second year and third year associates are doing. And if you are not happy with what they're doing, that's not the place for you, because that's the track you're on. And if you don't get off early, you're going to be stuck. And that's where you'll become a very unhappy employee, and things will get worse for you. And that is not fair to the employer, and it's not fair to you. So really think about where you are and do that in increments. I said for businesses, look at your 2 to 5 year plan and see. For individuals, you can do that. I live in 5-year cycles. You can have it shorter cycles, but really do a self-assessment. One of the things that's becoming kind of odd is, how do we handle a workforce at home? And here's where you have to be careful, because a lot of times the workforce at home, and I apologize for the typo, because sometimes my brain puts in letters where they shouldn't be, but with the workforce working at home, it raises issues of, do I really need all the space I'm renting? And if you don't, then it's going to ripple through the economy with real estate companies having to renegotiate loans. So renegotiate space and access. So there are all kinds of things that we have to think about with working from home, but also one of the most important pieces is security of communications. You know, in the office, you might have your VPN, your virtual network, so that you can control it. But when you're working from home, sometimes you don't have that kind of security, and hacking can occur. So we want to make sure that if someone is allowed to work from home, it is through a secure network. A lot of accounting firms use portals. The Social Security Administration, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, they use portals. Those are helpful and secure. They may be expensive, but it's something to think about if you're thinking of, maybe I'll have all my workforce working from home. I think you also, as an individual, you need to reevaluate how you're investing. when I say that, it's that some people always put their eggs in one basket. And I think there you want to talk with a financial advisor, financial planner, because you may need to be much more diverse if you're going to thrive or survive this downturn. If you're on a fixed income, for example, it isn't going to get any better. It's going to get more challenging. If you're not on a fixed income, if you're working 3 jobs, you really need to think about that. If you're married, whether it is worth it to have one person working at home or being at home worker, i.e. housewife and mother and caring for children. There's a lot of work involved in that that's not compensated, but it's incredibly valuable work. That may be a better financial option for you than to have 2 people working outside of the home. Just keep that in mind. You have to think about those budgets, put those budgets together and think about your investments. And sometimes I've got to say, when they talk about the joys of home ownership, houses need planning. Things happen. And so you want to make sure you're doing all the things you can to meet what you need. And the thing I tell people is know a want from a need. You need air. You need food. You need health care. You want fancy shoes. You want beautiful clothes. You want things. But once you start pairing off the wants versus the needs, and make sure you communicate with your children, if you have them, you can find there's a lot of room for saving money, and then you can rethink those investments. I recall many years ago talking to a woman who had bought some fairly expensive, from my perspective, athletic shoes for her son. And she said he won't wear them because they didn't have a particular name on them. And I asked her what she would do. And she said, well, I guess I better get some shoes that he'll wear. Now, I can tell you, I would have loved that to be the response of my parents, but my parents would say, okay, how's that barefoot working for you? You know, it would just get down to very simple things. If we can't afford it, we can't afford it. But make sure the whole family knows that here's the plan. And when I talk about budgets, I encourage people to work as a family toward a budget. That way, everybody knows what their role is. And they have a part to play in that, because children can be as productive in helping you save money as a spouse can. And if you don't have a spouse, all the more reason to look at want versus need. So this is not an issue for whether you're married or not. It's just a matter of a human process. And once you have a firm footing on the want versus need, I think you'll find that you have more control. And ultimately, that becomes the issue. Who controls my fate? If you as an employee think the employer controls my fate, wrong. You control your fate. There are decisions you can make, but plan those decisions. And that way you'll feel better. And that goes to that morale issue. For if you are not happy where you're working, but you're going to continue to work there, at some point, some decision is going to be made. Either A, I didn't get a promotion that I thought I should have gotten, or B, there's a hiring and somebody else gets an assistant and I don't. There's going to be something that's going to disappoint you. And once that first disappointment comes, it sticks in your craw and you become a morale issue. And the employer needs to know that too. If you're going to hire someone, understand why and understand where they fit and understand the dynamics, because if you don't do those kinds of analyses and ask those kinds of questions, you are leading to a morale issue. So there's a role to play for the employer and a role to play for the employee. Next slide. Employers, remember the mission. And when I say remember the mission, I mean remember, preserve the enterprise, preserve the customer, preserve the workforce. Keep that in mind. It's all three, not one versus the other. Once you start missing one, as I said, the house of cards starts falling apart pretty fast. And with that employer mission to the workforce, preserve the workforce. That's where I said communication, consistency, documentation, fairness. That all applies, and you'll find that helps you with your workforce as well. Sometimes we think of long-term employees and we either take advantage of them, as we can't imagine them going anywhere else, or we don't take those actions to recognize them. And so what I have told employers, and it's certainly the case when I was working in private firms, what you do is look at creative ways to reward people. It's not that gold watch after 50 years. It's what can you do for me now? Whether it's even having small bonuses for everybody, or staff parties, or just thinking scholarship opportunities. There are things that are non-work related that can have a real impact on the workforce. And the example I use is when companies start supporting the United Way, and then you have teams, and it creates a bonding that we're all going and pushing in the same direction. That's very creative, and it helps the community. And as long as you help the community, I think you also help the enterprise. And I mentioned before that we're in a world where we're hiring Generation Zers, I think they're called. Be aware of what that new workforce is like and what its priorities are, which may not be your priorities. And you may want to hire someone who's an up-and-comer, but if that doesn't fit with the model that you have, don't get mesmerized by an opportunity. And I tell people that you may hear from a relative, a friend, oh, this person is wonderful. Don't stint on your policies. Do those interviews. Have those clear metrics. And if the person doesn't fit, the person doesn't fit, no matter how many people believe that individual would work well in your environment. And sometimes, remember, they just want that person to have a job. Sometimes they can do well. So understand what your hiring practices will be, should be, and do not falter or change that because of a connection. That will create a morale issue in the end. You don't need that if you're a small business, and you certainly don't need that if you're a larger business. Now, it was interesting when I worked at Wilson Art, there was one question that was asked, and that is, who's more important? Manufacturing or sales and marketing? And the answer was very surprising because a lot of people thought it was sales and marketing because that gets your product out there. But they said, no, it's manufacturing. If you don't have anything to sell, what are you out there? And that made sense. But also there's a role for a lot of departments. But if you're large enough to have those departments, make sure you use them well. You can have, for example, employee advocates, sometimes they're unions, but I think the bottom line for the workforce is if you pay them fairly, don't look for some, have a salary assessment done that uses communities that have low wages and go, we did a salary assessment and here's what you're entitled to. Look at how people are living in your community, because remember, every employee you have has a family. They're probably supporting some folks, and it doesn't make sense to have some people well rewarded and some people not rewarded when they work just as hard. The question is what you value and what the company values, and get that implemented and institutionalized as a culture of the company. And I encourage employers not to create false straw men. That is, some people are sacrosanct and some people are fodder. I think all employees who work for the employer, if they're doing their best and the company is thriving, share the wealth. I remember that one of my favorite musicals is Hello, Dolly. And there is a line from Hello, Dolly that says, money is like manure. It doesn't work unless you spread it around. Next slide. Now, I've given you the advice, and I use that old wine in new bottles
Hey,
because,
Gail, I want to
uh,
interrupt for just a second. We only have 4 minutes left.
right?
So I just wanted to give you a time check.
Thank you, because I was just going to go, this is basically everything I've said applies to every business, and sometimes we lose sight of it. It's old wine, but there may be a new bottle. That new bottle may be COVID-19, but have your old practices. And this is just a recap of what I have been saying, that human capital is still one of the most important investments of any business. You want to attract and maintain good talent. That means you're going to need to be flexible, nimble, and be careful how you use social media and information. And I say how the employees use it and how the employer reacts to it. And don't leave your humanity behind, because ultimately that's what a business is. It's not a thing, it's a person. It's not a number, it's a person. Never lose sight of the fact that you're working with humans, and that requires communication. I think we can go to the next slide. Final thoughts. Always contact counsel before acting. And when I say counsel, I'm not necessarily meaning legal counsel. For those of you who are new, there is an organization called the Society of Human Resource Management. SHARM is how we say it. If you're not a member of it, explore it and become a member. That is a wonderful organization. They have a website, they have a blog. They can, every conceivable scenario they've seen and they've written about. So do use that. And I mentioned before, very helpful resources are DOL.gov, EEOC.gov, and SBA.gov, which is for the Small Business Administration. Don't be afraid to Google the information. Use an attorney when you need one. I tell you, most times you need a banker and an accountant, and that helps you go a long way before you need a lawyer. And on that note, any questions that we missed?
Gail, I want to thank you so much for an amazing, amazing talk. I learned so much. I'm on page 4 of notes on my iPad. I'm just saying. I personally learned so much, and I'm sure that the audience has as well. And this is going to be one of our most cherished videos in our library, because I think you gave out so much great information. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. And as one host says, thank you for the privilege of your time, audience.